and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm back with another case, and this video again is sponsored by Now TV. Is a leading streaming service in the UK. They do all sorts of different types of premium content, so you can get box sets, movies, sports, all things entertainment really. You can get so much on there, which is fantastic. And also something that's even more exciting is that Sky Crime has now launched, which is Sky's first all true crime channel. So you can also watch all the content from Sky Crime channel over on Now TV using their entertainment pass, which is only $8.99 a month. So if you do want to check out all that premium content, not only on Sky Crime but also over on Now TV, I will leave a link to the entertainment pass down in the description box below so you can go and check that out. For today's video, we're going to be discussing the case of Garrett Phillips, and the main reason this is in collaboration with Now TV is because there is a brand new documentary that is now released on there, so you can go watch it on Sky Crime and on Now TV using the entertainment pass. The documentary is called Who Killed Garrett Phillips, and honestly it's a fantastic documentary. It's been done so well, and you really do get to see both sides of like the trial and the whole very confusing case in a lot of detail. So it's been done very well, and it's definitely worth a watch. I would also just like to say before I continue on into the video, I filmed kind of the main content of this video on another day, so I am going to look different in a second, so I apologise about that. Hopefully it won't annoy you too much. So yes, if you do want to hear about the case of Garrett Phillips, then keep on watching, and if you do want to check out the documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips, I'll leave a link to the entertainment pass on Now TV down below in the description. So this case takes place in the year of 2011 on the date of the 24th of October. Garrett Phillips was a 12-year-old boy living in a place called Potsdam in upstate New York with his mother and his younger brother. Garrett was known to be a joker and had a habit of being quite a rowdy young boy, playing practical jokes on all the other children. He did have a number of friends at school, however at school he was known to be particularly restless, and he drew a lot of attention to himself during lessons. In his spare time he liked playing sports, he liked fishing, hunting, racing around on quad bikes. He was all round a very adventurous, sporty, lively young man. On the afternoon of October 24th in the year of 2011, Garrett had been the only one in his family's second floor apartment on Market Street in Potsdam, New York. His mother, Tandy Cyrus, had headed out with her youngest son, Aaron, to take him to basketball practice. The plan had been for Garrett to join them at a later point at basketball practice after he'd finished his homework, where he could see his brother and his friends before Tandy drove them both home. At around 5 p.m, Garrett's neighbours in the small apartment building heard a loud crash like something falling down. Immediately after, they'd heard the moans and something they described as either a child or a woman's voice crying either no or help. A young couple who were in this apartment building had heard this noise. They decided they would go and check on it and see if maybe someone had hurt themselves, if everything was okay, see what the noise was that was coming from this apartment. They hadn't known exactly who had lived in this particular apartment, although they had admitted to seeing Garrett and his younger brother riding around on their bikes, playing outside in the hallway, in the garden, all things like that. So they knew that in all likelihood they lived in this apartment, they just didn't know them on a personal level. Marissa Vogel, who had been one of the neighbours that had heard this and decided to go and check on the noise, she knocked on the apartment door and listened for any sign of anyone inside to see if anyone maybe had hurt themselves and needed help. And at first all she heard was silence after she knocked, but as she listened closer she heard the very distinctive sound of the door's lock clicking. Now according to her, this noise had concerned her even more when it was combined with the crash and then this faint noise of someone saying help or no. And so at 5:07 p.m. that day she decided to ring the police and report what she'd heard. Around 10 minutes later, an officer arrived to carry out just a welfare check on whatever had happened inside the apartment, just to make sure that if there was anyone in there, if they had heard correctly, everyone was okay. But when he knocked on the door himself, he had no response either. All he heard was a very faint noise of footsteps coming from inside the apartment. When he heard these footsteps, he decided to knock once again, but this time there was no noise. And once again he knocked, this time yelling police, just to alert anyone inside of his presence. You know, if someone was hurt or if someone was scared, maybe if it was a child inside and they didn't want to open the door to strangers, he just wanted to make sure that they knew it was the police at the door. but no one answered. He decided his best port of call was to get into contact with the man who dealt with the building's maintenance to see if he had a key so that he could come and let him into the apartment just to carry out this welfare check. The maintenance manager had been out with his family at this point, but he told him that he would head straight to the building after he dropped his family off so that he could let them into the apartment. And in the meantime, the officer decided to take it upon himself to go around to all of the neighbours that were in the building at the time, see what they'd heard, speak to them all, see if they knew who lived there, all that sort of thing, basically collecting as much information as he could. This is when he learned of exactly what noise everyone had heard, as well as the fact that they were aware of the two young boys living there with their mother. Many of the neighbours had said that despite the two young boys often making noise, as two young boys would do in their apartment, the bang and the moan that they'd heard struck them all as unusual. The building manager swiftly let them into the apartment, and this is where they came across Garrett Phillips lying on the floor on his back in the master bedroom of the apartment. At this point, they hadn't known exactly who this young boy was, but they simply placed him as being around 10 years old. He was wearing a t-shirt and blue and white checkered shorts. At this point, the boy had no pulse and he wasn't breathing, and the officer proceeded to attempt to carry out CPR on the young boy. Paramedics were very swiftly called to the scene and continued the officer's efforts to keep this boy alive, and soon placed him in an ambulance and drove him straight to something called the Canton Potsdam Hospital, which was located nearby. Doctors there had been able to keep him alive for a very brief time, but sadly at around 7:20 p.m. that evening, 12-year-old Garrett Phillips was pronounced dead. The immediate factors that were considered by the first responders by that point was just exactly who this young boy was, where his mother and brother were, as well as who would have been in the apartment with him at that time. In a different bedroom of the apartment to the one in which Garrett was found, officers discovered a window that had its blinds and protective screen completely damaged and wide open, and it was soon speculated that if there had been someone in the apartment when all this occurred, it may have been a point of exit for them. Garrett's mother, Tandy, had been informed of what had happened while at her son's basketball practice, and her first port of call had been to call up a man named John Jones. Now, John Jones was an ex-boyfriend of hers, but he was also the local sheriff's deputy. When she'd been told that something had happened, she had immediately called John Jones and told him that she wanted him to meet her at the hospital where Garrett had been taken so that he could be there with them and help them through everything and make sure that she knew what was expected of her. At the time of Tandy's arrival at the hospital, her son had still been alive, but sadly didn't remain so for long. The examination of the remains found no signs of bruises or cuts, but it was ultimately ruled a homicide. Investigators determined that Garrett Phillips had died as a result of strangulation and suffocation, and so the hunt for his killer began. In order to understand the root of the investigation into Garrett's murder, I'm going to just very briefly go into a little bit of background into his mother, Tandy Cyrus, and you'll kind of understand why very, very soon. So Garrett was born in the year of 1999, and he was the firstborn to Tandy and her husband at the time, Robert Phillips. When Garrett was just 3 years old, Robert had a brain aneurysm and sadly died as a result. A few years later, Tandy then remarried and this time had her second son, Aaron, but this marriage didn't survive much longer past this. During this time, Tandy had been training at a local police academy and soon graduated, only to decide that she didn't then want to pursue a career as being a police officer. She worked 2 jobs to support her sons, including working as a bartender in a local bar during night shifts. It was working in this bar that she met a man named Oral Nick Hillary. He was a bit different to the men that she might typically come across, especially working in this bar. He was Jamaican and he was also particularly in shape. He was very well spoken. As it would turn out, he was actually the head coach for the Division 3 soccer team at Clarkson University nearby. Nick Hillary would stay up at the bar talking to Tandy for hours, even after everyone else in the bar had left and she was getting ready to close up. She learned that Nick had 3 children himself, but he at that point was with their mother but wasn't planning on staying with her for very long, and the pair spoke of their dreams of leaving Potsdam and pursuing successful careers in nicer places. The pair began to date officially, and before long they moved in together along with Tandy's 2 sons Garrett and Aaron, as well as Hillary's daughter Shanna Kay. His 2 sons would also spend some nights in the week staying with them when they weren't staying with their mother, and so they had a particularly busy household on a lot of days. In the summer months of 2011, Tandy learned that her sons weren't actually happy at all with the living arrangements, in the sense that they found Hillary too strict on them. He was a very authoritative and very disciplinarian figure. He would would refuse to let them watch any TV on school nights. He would make sure that they were disciplined correctly. So they didn't like the way that he was treating them, and they didn't want to live with him anymore. So they told their mother that they wanted him to move out so that they could live alone with her. And so Tandy decided that what she would do to keep her sons happy would be to take her 2 sons and move out, just the 3 of them, while her and Hillary remained a couple. And this had seemed as though it was a successful plan, as Hillary had been seemingly supportive. He even helped them move in, and it all kind of just seemed to be going okay, like it was a good idea. At some point after this though, it is known that the relationship is said to have ended. I couldn't find exactly like why or how or when it ended, but it just seems to be as though it kind of like fizzled out. I don't really know. There isn't a lot of like solid evidence to suggest why, but there were, according to some sources, allegedly some incidents in which she would find Hillary inside of her apartment because he still had a key. I don't know how plausible these are. I don't know how reliable these sources are, but some sources say that because he still had a key, there was a couple of incidents in which she would come home and find him there, and she wanted him out of the apartment. After this, she demanded that he give her his copy of the key, and this is what happened. And according to her, the last time that she recalled him being in their apartment was at the end of September of 2011. At a very early point in this investigation, police investigators appeared to have focused their efforts on proving the guilt of Nick Hillary. As I said, he was born and raised in Jamaica, and he served in the US Army before he then started his career as a soccer coach. Nick Hillary was informed in person of Garrett's death on the same night that it had actually occurred by a lieutenant, and then he was called in for questioning in the days following. When he was taken down to the station just for some questioning, the police chief had allegedly just completely refused to let him go, and he wasn't allowed to go to work, he was told. He was even strip searched, so he had all of his belongings taken off him. He was completely strip searched and everything was taken photos of. So they took photos of him without his clothes on, they took photos of all of his belongings, they took his phone, everything. They even read him his Miranda rights, even though he wasn't being arrested. But he was in there for a long time. I think he was held there for about 8 hours or something ridiculous like that, while they just questioned him over and over again. If you do watch the documentary, which I do highly recommend, they do show clips of the footage of him being inside the police station at that point, and some of the questions and the conversations they had, and them strip searching him, and it's all very, very, very brutal. Considering it was so early on in the investigation, it does just give you the impression that from a very early point they were adamant that he had something to do with it. 2 witnesses at this point had allegedly told officers that they had seen Hillary near the apartment building not long before Garrett's death. Someone also claimed to have seen his car a few blocks away from the building, and Garrett's uncle even said that he'd seen Hillary driving in the area at around 4:30 p.m. that day. According to some sources, investigators had checked through Hillary's phone records, and they'd found that exactly 48 minutes after the emergency services call was made around Garrett's apartment, so when the person had found Garrett and the emergency services call was made, exactly 48 minutes after that, Hillary had placed a call to his lawyer. Hillary had also been coaching a soccer practice that same evening, and some of the people there had allegedly shared how they'd noticed he was acting a lot calmer than usual. Like I said, he was a bit of an authoritative figure, very disciplinarian, and since he was such kind of a strong disciplining figure at that point, some people had said it was allegedly quite strange that he was very, very calm at that point. The following day, he also coached this team during a game against another team, obviously, and even though his team won 2-0, he remained still the majority of the time allegedly, and showed little to no enthusiasm. The police lieutenant even claimed to see him with a distinctive limp on the very few occasions during that game that he did move, and he immediately considered the possibility of whether this could have been an injury that may have been occurred, so whether this was the injury or someone could have obtained a similar injury if they were the perpetrator of Garrett's murder, if they'd hastily jumped out the window as though they'd assumed. So yeah, as I said, while he was down in the police station, they literally searched him, they stripped him, took photos of everything, took all of his belongings, they fingerprinted him, they read him his rights even though he wasn't actually arrested, and then he was allowed to leave. He was told at first that he couldn't go to work, and then at around 7:30 or something like that, it was about 8 hours later, he was allowed to leave, but he was wearing a hazmat suit. The alleged sightings of Hillary, his apparent injury, and the stories of his and Garrett's previous issues in terms of their living situation all seem to argue the likelihood of Garrett Garrett having been involved in the attack. For weeks, the investigation continued with no arrest, and despite them all having Hillary's belongings and all of his movements to aid their investigation, they seemed to be making no headway. Tandy herself had allegedly made a statement that Hillary had always seen Garrett as a reason or a cause for their breakup, that he was kind of why she ended things with him or their relationship didn't work, as he'd allegedly made it clear that he thought that she allowed her sons to make all of her decisions for her. The year after Garrett's death, when there had been no advancements made in the investigation, Hillary had filed a lawsuit against those who had been carrying it out, claiming that it was unlawful, all of his rights had been violated, he was held unlawfully by these police officers. This was basically based on the fact that he'd had his whole house, his person searched, his property was taken from him without them issuing a warrant, and he'd been held for hours and read his Miranda rights even though there was no arrests and they didn't really have any reason to hold him there. He was just being taken in for questioning. And then this case began to kind of gain even more momentum when it became involved in a political campaign relating to a woman named Nicole Duvet, who had been campaigning to be elected as the St. Lawrence County District Attorney. She had directly introduced Garrett's case as well as a couple of others as a statement in her campaign, saying that she wanted these cases to be solved, that she was going to do everything to make sure that these cases were solved and that their family would get justice. And I think the main issue with this was that as much as people agreed that all of these families did deserve justice as well as the victims, it was also a bit of a hit or miss reaction. People either agreed or they really didn't with the fact that she'd directly named the case in her political campaign. Some people think it was a good thing because it means that it was gaining more reaction and people were seeing it and was gaining more awareness, while others argued that it wasn't really the right thing to do to involve it in your political campaign, but obviously that's completely down to a matter of opinion. I just thought it was kind of an interesting point to discuss. She'd made promises that this case, as well as the others named, would see some form of final sentencing in relation to the suspects that the investigators had deemed as guilty, and so as a result of this reanimation of the focus on these cases, Hillary was indicted for a second-degree murder charge in 2014. In July of 2014, he entered a not guilty plea, but no matter the outcome of this trial, his life would be changed forever. The case had gained so much public attention by that point, and people had kind of already made up their mind. Some people, the public, either thought he was guilty completely or people thought he was innocent. No matter what had happened, the public already knew about it and a lot of opinions had already been formed. So by this point, he'd already lost his coaching position job at Clarkson University. There was just a lot, and sadly his life was forever changed no matter what the outcome. Hillary was released on bail following this, and then a few months later the next occurrence in the case came about when the judge working on the case stated publicly that he believed that the district attorney who had been looking into the case and questioning witnesses and things like that had intentionally badgered and bullied Hillary's daughter during the investigation process, and that this should be dismissed. The district attorney then decided that her next port of call for the case was to take it before a grand jury, which once again saw Hillary be indicted at the start of 2015. In preparation for this trial, a jury was built from the surrounding area, as it typically would, a bunch of regular, mundane, everyday people being called in for jury duty. However, one of the main issues with this, in regards to this case in particular, was that it had become so widely known and publicised. It was covered by loads of media outlets, and like I said, a lot of people had already formed their opinions. It would be virtually impossible to find an entire jury who were able to be completely impartial, who could perform on this jury, who could be on this jury without acting in any form of bias. And this is exactly what Hillary and his team had realised when the jury was created. And so Hillary himself ultimately decided that he wanted his trial to be a bench trial, meaning that the judge would be the sole decider of his verdict as opposed to a jury. There was a lot that had occurred during the course of this trial regarding the evidence, as the defence were obviously arguing that Hillary was completely innocent and that the real perpetrator was in fact someone else, while the prosecution was obviously arguing a complete different fact. They were saying that Hillary killed Garrett. The prosecution introduced a witness who had been one of the neighbours living in Garrett's building, who had heard the noise on the day of Garrett's murder. He and his girlfriend had been outside the building, just stood outside changing a tyre on their car, I believe, when they heard this noise. Now, if they'd been stood where they were when they were changing the tyre, they would have been in direct eye line, so they would have been able to directly see the window, which would ultimately be found to be broken as though someone had climbed through it. This means that if they'd stayed there even after the noise had occurred, they likely would have seen someone climbing out of it. However, when this noise had occurred, they decided to go inside and see what was going on, meaning that someone could have quite easily escaped through the window without them seeing. This particular witness was called in to provide a statement in which he said that he had seen a shadowy dark figure of an adult male stood in the window of Garrett's apartment just before the noise has occurred. In the documentary, you will see the discussion in which they say that they were given the impression that he was very, very sure of this sighting, and he might even have said very confidently that he knew he'd seen Hillary specifically in the apartment. However, the main dispute regarding this was that his girlfriend, who had been with him at the time, like I said, they were both outside changing a tyre. When she'd learned of this, she provided a completely different statement that suggested that his statement wasn't in fact maybe exactly accurate, that it could have in fact been anyone in that window if they had seen someone, seeming as though that his sighting may have been influenced by media coverage or his own personal opinion. It just really seemed to place like a strong doubt hearing his girlfriend's side of the story and what they could and couldn't see. And thanks to this significant doubt in this statement, it really started to become clear that the prosecution's argument was particularly weak and it had very little support. By this point, everything that they kind of had to offer was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. One thing that at this point hadn't really been explored had been the potential involvement of John Jones, who had been the sheriff's deputy and Tandy's ex-boyfriend. From what I can gather, there isn't really any immediately convincing evidence that makes it like obvious that John Jones should be a suspect, that he was the person who killed Garrett. But I think the point is more that there wasn't really any necessarily convincing evidence that Nick Hillary was guilty, and yet he was immediately seen as a suspect. It is discussed, though, that John Jones would have had just as much of an ability to have been the perpetrator as Nick Hillary had, due to a number of factors, including his house had been located exactly halfway between Garrett's apartment and Garrett's school, where he was last seen alive on CCTV footage leaving the school. The argument was then made in the trial that it would have been entirely possible for Hillary to have seen Garrett walking home from school and followed him, but this could have also been said for John Jones, or even anyone else for that matter. And there are a lot of people out there, especially if you do an online search of this case, who do agree that John Jones was not investigated nearly enough, considering the extent to which the investigation looked into Nick Hillary, especially when the argument is made regarding how his and Tandy's relationship ended. Towards the end of Tandy and John's relationship, she had met Hillary while working in the bar, like I explained. So this had been while she had been with John Jones, and the more that they'd kind of talked and seen each other and met up and had these conversations, the more Tandy and John's relationship had suffered and ultimately ended. So it did seem as though it was kind of a likely impact of this kind of occurrence, that his ego had been bruised, that maybe he wasn't the biggest fan of Nick Hillary, maybe his reputation was dented a little bit because he was known in the area, and that he'd had his girlfriend almost like stolen from him by this unknown man. So there's all these potential motive that some people have argued. The result of the trial of Nick Hillary saw a not guilty verdict having been given by the judge, who decided that the circumstantial evidence had not provided a strong enough support for the prosecution's argument, as well as the means in which they had collected and investigated the case had been verging on unlawful. This meant that Nick Hillary was from then on a free man, but one thing is clear, like I said, is that his life would have been permanently changed from that point. Despite the fact that he was declared as not guilty, his life was changed forever, and in addition to this, Garrett's family still didn't have any justice for their son's death. So the main reason this case remains so big to this day is purely around the discussion of the means in which the investigation was carried out from the get-go, as it seems as though the investigation immediately focused on Hillary being a suspect, if not being focused on him being guilty. Many have argued that it just wasn't a fair or just investigation, and a lot of it can be down to all forms of prejudice that may have been formed by a number of people directly involved in the case, as well as the sheer fact that there just didn't seem to be any strong or clear evidence in the case against him to be made. However, there are a number of people out there who do feel as though Hillary is guilty and that he's managed to get away with murder, while others believe that the person responsible could have been John Jones, the scorned ex-boyfriend, or even just someone else completely different that hasn't been explored. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like I said, you can watch this documentary that I discussed in this video over on Now TV using the entertainment pass, which I'll have linked down below. The documentary, obviously, Who Killed Garrett Phillips, is absolutely amazing. Like I said, it does go into a lot of detail and it really clarifies a lot. This case, as I did say, does divide a lot of people, so it's really interesting to see both sides of the case in so much depth. So please, honestly, it's my favourite part about doing these videos is when I see your guys' discussions down below, so please feel free to start a discussion on your opinions down below. Like I said, it just seems to really divide people, this case, because some people are so strongly adamant that one side is guilty while others believe something else, and there's just so many different theories and strong opinions. So please do start a discussion down below because it would be fascinating to hear your guys' thoughts. So yes, leave your thoughts down below, check out the entertainment pass on Now TV as well as all the other content you can find on there as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, I hope you found this interesting and I will see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching, bye.